Hi, it's Natalia Hooker here from Alaya Books, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Blake Kendall. He's written a magnificent memoir or life story of his family called Those Bloody Trees. And please tell us, Blake, a little bit about the book.
It's a book about intergenerational questions of what leads us here into this moment. And I think in such a moment of the planetary emergency, of changing climates and some of the harder aspects of what faces the earth today, it's a book that delves into the question of legacy and intergenerational knowledge, as well as trauma, grief, and the layers of what gets passed down over the years. So it was the book that 5 years ago, when my mum passed away, it was the book that my mum wanted to write, that she never got to. And it's a book that I listened to. I think I need to say that I co-authored it with my mum. I don't think I authored this book. I think it was a collaboration with my mum, for all of those reasons, where it was more about finding the voice, or finding how to interact with a gentleness between those who have been and we who we are. Something like that.
So how many years did it take you to write the book?
I wrote the book over 2 years. Although, of course, it continues. It's that process of, it was 2 years of writing, and then, of course, many years of editing, and continuing to reflect on how to open it up. And I think it's one of those things where, you know, sometimes it's quite easy to be able to write. You know, I feel like when I write, I go into a trance and I can connect to that experience. But I suppose probably the process of editing is not necessarily about editing for an audience, but actually more editing in terms of translating back into this world. What does it mean to take the words of the wind and put them back with the people? As I describe it, it's often like the land of the living. Though this is the first novel that I've ever written, I've spent, you know, the last 15 years writing and performing poetry and spoken word and all of those wonderful different multimodal forms, and embracing that. And I think the long form has always been something that I've connected to.
So could you please tell everybody where the story starts and just give a general idea of what time periods it covers, how many generations?
Yeah, so the story starts in San Sebastian. So my
In
family is
Spain?
Basque.
Yes.
In Spain. So, well, we call it Spain just to comply with nationalism, but we're Basque. So independence. But yeah, the story it starts in San Sebastian with, as far back as my family tree goes, with Luisa, the mother of Josefa. And And the book follows a lot of it's the matriarchal lineage within my family, which is a beautiful celebration. As I said, it's the book that my mum wanted to write. She wanted to write about the women in her family,
Yes.
in our family.
So what year is this where it begins?
This is about 1830.
Okay.
So, on a historic context, I absolutely did research. The book is historically orientated. It follows research, it follows, as much as we know. I'll put it that way. I use a lot of the traces. I use all historic records of birth, death, marriage, all of those conventional sort of protocol that dictate the structures of how we remember. And then, of course, imagination fills in the blanks. But we start in San Sebastian, and part of that journey is one of leaving Donostia, the Euskara name. And we leave that region of the world post fires, and also post British colonialism. And that was what brought Josefa out to Australia. But I think what I always found so beautiful was that the book is primarily based in one place. Those Bloody Trees is the story that focuses on one family property,
Okay.
my family property, over the generations, that was settled in about 1860.
Okay.
As European settlers. So,
Which part of
course,
Australia?
this is in the Hunter Valley.
Oh, good.
So a couple of hours north of Sydney um, in Aqaba land, the First Nation peoples there. And I think, I would say that that's one of the biggest confronting things in writing the book as well, that it's a story of a settler family, my family, and it's about confronting those layers of history, those layers of dealing with First Nation dispossession, and all of those layers of what it means for a family and community and generations to try and have a connection with the land, despite the fact that they only exist because of the exploitation of somebody else. And I think that that in many ways is a subtle but pivotal factor of the book. So I refer to the book as a book that my mum wanted to write, but in many ways, it's not the book my mum was ever going to write.
The book you wanted to write.
It's the book that I wrote in honor of my mum. And
but it's a very important book for Australia, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is a question that we all need to come to terms with more and more, particularly when we come from a colonized, settler sort of background, where we have to come to terms with what the historic legacy and what the contemporary overflow actually feels like. And part of that is about a reckoning, and a finding of peace, forgiveness, but also taking responsibility. And particularly in the face of a climate emergency, where we start to see that, the separation between people and nature is so far removed that especially within a context of dealing with, somewhere like Australia, the oldest living culture in the world, 65,000-year-old culture, when you try and understand what the settler experience has been, you're talking about a 150-year or 200-year legacy of grappling how to actually still have peace, still have love, still live with the expressions of life, love, death, decay, all of those beautiful spectrums of what it means to be alive and what it means to pass from life.
Mm.
But we do it within a context of also questioning what is the legacy? What is that intergenerational legacy? And I think that that's been, it's a deep theme of this book. It's a deep reckoning. It's a deep process. The reality is that over the 150 years that we follow within this book, we see the 40,000-year-old Basque culture taken away from the land, moving over as migrants, living in Australia. The family then developing a business which becomes a sawmill.
Oh, okay.
And their job was to cut down trees.
Oh,
To the point where someone like my grandfather, his role was also to be a coal miner. So constantly you have this inherent, bastardization, or at least, conflict with the natural world. But you still see this family property remain for 150 years until my grandmother leaves.
okay.
And when my grandmother comes into the story, that is the moment where imagination turns into memory and the story shifts.
Oh, okay.
And suddenly we hear that moment of my grandmother leaving the land, the family property that she hated, and moving into town.
Okay.
And similarly, my mum would leave the town, travel the country, travel the world. Similarly, I would then be the next generation that would travel the world even further. And I think if I was to say, what is the conclusion? I think there is a lot to be said about the process of alienation and the process of separation, and the process that over the generations, what we're actually also confronting is not only a question of what role history or the past actually holds as a legacy for how we interact with the present, but so too it's actually it's a journey of acknowledging that there are many things that are maybe not left behind, but there are many things that are quite separate, and we've allowed that to be separate.
Okay.
Personally, I acknowledge that the book was written in trance. The whole book is written in single sessions. I never edited the book. I actually sat down and would often write for perhaps 4 hours or 5 hours at a time. Only ever written sitting under a tree, only ever with my back pressed to a tree, and listening to the wind.
Oh.
And I think the process of, my mum passed away 5 years ago. I carried her through for 9 months, and I spent the last 3 days of her life in meditation by her side. And when she passed, I was lying with her. But when she passed, I experienced the moment where she transitioned into the wind. And from exactly that moment, I ran outside and I sat in the park and I started writing.
Oh.
And I started listening. And so I think, yeah, I didn't write the book, I listened to it. And I think I'm a great listener. I think that's probably where my superpower is. And I think what I've realized, you know, it was one of those old sayings that I think my mum picked up on a fridge magnet that she repeated multiple times. And I quote her, which is live, learn, and pass it on. And I don't think it's about just the process of my own grief cycle, but rather the process of opening voice and channeling and collectively sharing, whether they're my words, your words, words of ancestors, or words of Joe Blow over in the fields. The process of actually collectively having dialogue, that is where things can be felt. And I 100% think that I've transformed in writing this book. Absolutely. I'm a completely different person. It completely helped me in my grief cycle, but also in my return to the land of the living. I think that's the greatest gift we can give as writers. The greatest gift we can give as writers is to give a vocabulary in order to give value to what this process of life really is.
You're amazing, Blake.
You're amazing. So nice to share. You wonderful soul.
Awesome.
My pleasure
to talk to you. Yeah.
And with the butterfly behind you, it feels right. We are the creatures of transformation. Thank you, wonderful you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to share.